Welcome to the Same Side Selling Podcast. I am your host, Ian Altman. On this week's episode, I want to talk about what causes delays in sales deals. So people often come to me and they say, I've been working with this client. Wow, I spent a lot of time with them. We had a lot of discussions. They seemed really excited, and now they've gone silent. So what could be causing that? Why is it that they were so excited to work with us, and now all of a sudden they don't return our phone calls, they're not responding to our emails, or maybe they are responding. They say, hey, you know what? We're going to push this out till next month. Or maybe it's another month, or, you know what? We're going to push this into next quarter. And what we know is that oftentimes when that happens, it's really just someone telling us something to be polite, but they really have no interest in what it is that we're doing. And it leads to frustration on the part of salespeople, because you're thinking to yourself, man, they seem serious, and now I have to explain why I forecasted this deal to happen, and then it's not happening. Which also ties to how salespeople often will forecast deals to close on either the first day or the last day of the month, which usually tells me that they're wishing something will happen in that time frame, because when you're dealing with a client who's got a specified process for making decisions, rarely does it happen on the last day of the first day of the month. But when you don't know, usually pick the last day of the month, because that way no one's going to bother you until it gets close to that. So how long should we wait on a deal that seemed good and now they keep pushing it out? So maybe it started in January and they said, oh, we'd love to get this thing done by the end of January. And then end of January comes and goes, and now you're in February. And they say, well, February is only 28 days. It's 4 weeks. No big deal. Next thing you know, it slips to March, April, May. Pretty soon we're in December and we're thinking, wow, maybe January was the right date. They just didn't say which year. So how do we get to the root of that and figure out what's actually going on? Well, there could be a good reason for the delay. For example, they may have to get things in order on their end before they can take advantage of whatever it is that you're delivering. So we want to ask them, well, hey, what is it that's causing this delay? And they may give you a good reason. There's a marketing firm that I've been talking to about helping us with some of our messaging. And as we were discussing these concepts with them, we realized we're going to do a massive redesign on our websites. And I said, look, we're going to push this thing back because we're going to do this massive redesign first. And I'm sure initially they were thinking, oh, they're just blowing us off. And I said, no, we actually want to get our ducks in a row before we engage with you. Otherwise, we're likely to spend money with you and not get the results we're looking for. And so I'm keeping them informed, and I think they can see that, okay, this is a real deal. So there are other things that could have impacted or pushed out the priority for a project. So maybe you were talking to somebody about something involving their operations, and all of a sudden now they have a compliance issue. And the compliance issue could lead to them being shut down completely and out of business. Well, guess what? Your operational efficiency play is no longer that important to them, because now they have something that's mission critical. If they don't solve it, they're out of business. And oftentimes what clients will say is, look, we can't be distracted by something else, so we have to do this. If you can have the conversation and understand why it is that they're moving things out, you might be able to say to them, hey, if we could keep the ball moving on this without distracting your team or your resources, would that be helpful? And oftentimes the client will say, oh yeah, we just figured we had to be involved. Nope. If we can make it so that you're spending no more than 15 minutes per week on this, is this still worth pursuing? Or should we just hold off for a while? And that way it gives us a little bit better insight. So let me give you some things that you can do when it comes to timing, so you can actually get a better sense of the reality and help your client create the urgency rather than you pushing urgency on them. We know when we tend to push, we get resistance and people push back. When instead, we create something of value and we kind of take it away. If people are interested, they follow. So when it comes to timing, if someone says, oh yeah, we're really interested in your solution, great. So what happens if you don't solve this? So that's in our same side quadrants, that's the upper right quadrant of impact. So what happens if you don't solve this? And you need to be skeptical. Let them convince you that they have a problem that's actually worth solving. Then you get to ask them, so when's the latest you want to have this completed and done and off your plate? And whatever date they give you, you want to say, okay, really, and why that date? Well, because it's got to be done by this date or X, Y, and Z happens. Sometimes they'll say to you, well, it's got to be done by November 1st. Why November 1st? Well, I just figured, we'll get back September, October, and, that seemed like a good date. That's not a real date. That's just someone picked a date out of thin air, and now they're expecting us to believe that date. So if we lead with, when's the latest you'd like to do this? A good follow-up question is, so that's the latest. You said November 1's the latest. So ideally, when would you like to have this done? And what are they likely to do? They're likely to give you a sooner date. And they're going to say, well, ideally it'd be more like October 1st. Okay. And then how long would you want to be testing and working through this to make sure it's right before you go live on October 1st? And the client's likely to say, well, a couple weeks, a month, whatever it happens to be. Fine. So now all of a sudden what you're showing them is, look, here's the latest you want this. And now here's the ideal date. And then you want to have some time for testing. Guess what? We need to move pretty quickly if we're going to hit that date, or should we move that date to a different time frame? See, we need to make sure that instead of pushing for a sale, that we're focused on what it is that we're solving for them. So if we ask the question about what it is they're trying to solve, if we ask the question, what happens if you don't solve this, then we say, when's the latest you want this? And ideally, when would you like to have it? And how far in advance do you want to test it? All of a sudden, we're creating urgency. Now, when you don't hear back from that client, what you get to say is, when we spoke, you mentioned that this is what would happen if you didn't solve this. You said that the latest you wanted to implement this was this date. Ideally, you wanted it by this other date, and here's when we had to deliver it. I haven't heard back from you. I just want to get a sense of, do we need to move those dates back, or is that still the timeline that's important to you? And that way, what you're doing is you're following up for their reasons versus your own reasons. Because unfortunately, the fact that you spend a lot of time and you forecast this deal is not a good reason for your client to follow up with you. If there are topics you'd like to see on the Same Side Selling podcast, just drop me a note to ian@ianaltman.com. See you next week.